For many people, it's natural to think that psychics, so-called, are actually doing tricks, that when they demonstrate telepathy or psychokinetic movement of objects or something like that, it's cleverly faked. Probably that's what most stage magicians think, and why wouldn't they? They know what the rest of us mostly don't, how easy it is to fool people. They know all the psychology and how to exploit it. So of course that's what they think psychics are doing, using techniques of sleight of hand and mind, psychological manipulation, distraction, and so on. But could it go the other way? Could a stage performance actually be based on something else? Not conjuring tricks, but genuine psychic ability. In this video, I'm going to talk about a famous mentalist act that was much admired by other stage magicians and suggest that actually it might not have involved tricks. Hello, my name's Robert. I'm the former editor of the Psi Encyclopedia, which gives in-depth descriptions of scientific investigations of psychic phenomena. Link in the description. And if you find this sort of content interesting, do please click like and subscribe. It really helps. This particular case concerns a hugely successful husband and wife act in the early 1900s, Agnes and Julius Zancig. They were Danish by birth, born in Copenhagen, Julius as Julius Jørgensen in 1857, Agnes as Agnes Clausen around the same time. They were childhood sweethearts, then lost touch and independently emigrated to the US, where eventually they met again, got married, and formed a professional act. It drew large audiences. They toured internationally and appeared at major venues, including the Alhambra Theatre in London's Leicester Square. Audiences weren't simply amused, they were mystified. Agnes sat or stood on the stage while Julius moved around the audience, asking for people to hand him some object. It could be an item of jewellery or a medal, an ornament, a train ticket, a toy, or any small personal object. Or he'd give them a notepad and ask them to write a word or a number or make a drawing. Whatever it was, he'd look at it and he'd ask Agnes to identify it, which he did, by all accounts, promptly and exactly, while standing on the stage with her back to him and often blindfolded as well. You don't see it much these days, but this sort of act was popular at the time, and it's done with a code. So the person handling the object is talking to the person on stage, saying something like, "I'm holding an object, can you tell me what it is?" But the exact words he uses, and perhaps also inflections in his speech, pauses and so on, correspond to a particular idea or number or letter of the alphabet, enough to convey quite detailed information. So when the audience think that person is asking the other person to identify the object, he's actually telling that person exactly what it is. Now, the thing about the Zancigs, what set them apart from all the other acts of this type, was that they were insanely good at it. If Julius had been given a coin, Agnes didn't just say, "It's a coin," or even, "It's a silver coin," or a copper coin. She'd name the currency and the amount. So she'd say, "It's a Swiss 2-franc piece of 1910. She could give the exact name on a visiting card, the destination on a rail ticket, and the date, a word that someone had just made up, or the elements of a complicated diagram. And another thing, her answers came so quickly it seemed she hardly needed time to think. Now, of course, stage magicians aren't psychic. It's just that their skill can make what they do seem literally impossible, to the point of convincing people that they must be, because what other explanation could there be? The Zancigs presented what they were doing as telepathy, actual real mind-to-mind communication. They called their show Two Minds with But a Single Thought. But no one now takes that seriously, least of all in the magic fraternity. It's just assumed that the effects were achieved by a combination of natural skill and understanding of human psychology, and perhaps most crucial of all, long hours of practice. Now, of course, this would be easy to fake if you had plants in the audience and you knew what the objects were going to be. But I don't think that's how other magicians thought it was being done. The great Harry Houdini said that they were among the greatest second sight artists that magical history records. He'd never come across anything better. Their performance was so convincing it also got the attention of British psychic researchers, people who investigated claims of telepathy and wouldn't normally have been interested in a stage act, but were so intrigued by the couple's extraordinary skill. These people weren't naive believers. They understood all about the tricks and spent much of their time exposing fake psychics. They knew perfectly well that this sort of performance is done by codes. They'd seen acts like that, and the trick was usually so obvious, it was clunky, it just wasn't interesting. This is how it worked. Take something really simple, like identifying a single letter. The person who's standing in the audience says, "I want the letter." The word want tells the person on the stage that the letter is A. If instead he says, "Go on, give this letter," the word go means the letter is B. "Can you tell me the letter?" indicates the letter C. "Now give this letter" is I. "Favor this letter" is J. "Tell" is K. "C" is L. "Well" is M, and so on through the whole alphabet. The same set can be adapted for numbers, dates, objects, and pretty much anything. The thing is, though, people really don't talk like this. It all sounds rather contrived. It might amuse and entertain for a while, but most people will soon cotton on. The point about the Zancigs, what made them so special, is that they didn't seem to be doing that. There were no obvious verbal patterns, no continuous patter by Julius to Agnes. And in fact, Julius didn't seem to say that much at all. So if he was using a code, it didn't give much for Agnes to work with. That's what got the researchers' attention. They weren't necessarily impressed by the fact of Agnes being blindfolded. They knew that's not reliable. You can sometimes peek underneath. But they didn't think she could see much from the stage, certainly not the print on a railway ticket or the name on a visiting card. In principle, there could be a much more subtle code based on the length of silences, breathing differences, voice inflections, and so on. But the distance between Julius and Agnes in a large theatre made that quite unlikely. And in fact, when Julius talked to the researchers, he made clear that he knew all about different kinds of codes. But he said they didn't use them because they seemed to have this facility that they didn't at all understand and that made the use of a code unnecessary. One of the researchers was William Baggerly, who practiced conjuring as a hobby and had been involved in investigations of spirit mediums, which often involved exposing their tricks. The Zancigs were happy to let him test them informally, so he and his wife spent an afternoon with them in their London apartment. In one test, Agnes sat at one end of the room with her back turned, while Julius wrote numbers in chalk on a slate. She named them correctly and in the right order. Of course, the couple might have agreed the numbers beforehand, so Baggerly repeated the test, this time writing the numbers himself. She still got them right. Then Agnes went into an adjoining room. Baggerly's wife wrote down some numbers, Julius added them together, and Agnes wrote the correct total on the slate. There was also a book test. The couple were given identical volumes of the same book. Julius was asked to open it anywhere and point to a line at that page. Agnes, sitting away from him and holding the other copy, opened it at the corresponding page and read out the same line. According to Baggerly, Julius' only communication to her was the word ready. He couldn't see how that single word, spoken without any obvious variation, could have conveyed both the page and the line. Baggerly then took Julius onto the landing while Agnes remained inside, and Baggerly's wife watched as she correctly wrote down 4 of 5 digits of a cheque that Baggerly had ripped from his checkbook and handed to Julius. He said Agnes didn't often make mistakes, but when she did, they were quite revealing. Once when he was at a theatre performance, as an audience member, he wrote a made-up word on a slip of paper and handed it to Julius. The word was Istapalapan. Agnes, standing on the stage with a blackboard, wrote down Istapalafsan, getting it almost exactly, but misspelling the second P as FS. Baggerly thought this looked more like a visual error than an auditory one. In other words, she seemed to be misperceiving the shape Julius was looking at, not mishearing a coded instruction. And this seemed to happen often. He also noticed an instance when Julius was working with a variety of objects that had been placed on a table. As he selected one, Agnes, without being asked, named some of the other objects as his hand passed over them. Or she might name an object lying next to the one he'd chosen. Again, this seemed to fit the Zancig's account. Agnes wasn't decoding a precise message. She was catching something from Julius's shifting visual attention. Another researcher noticed the same thing. His name was Oliver Lodge. He arrived late at a theatre performance one day while Agnes was on stage naming objects being handed to Julius. He saw that Julius turned and noticed him. And at that exact moment, he heard Agnes say, "Oliver," even though she couldn't see him herself, just as if Julius's recognition of him had passed straight into her mind. Baggerly also did drawing tests, and these are perhaps the most interesting because we can see the results ourselves. In one private experiment, Agnes sat behind a screen at the far end of the room, watched by Baggerly's wife. Baggerly produced an envelope containing cards with simple designs. Julius removed one and looked at it. It was a crescent moon shape. Agnes then drew a crescent moon. The only difference is the angle. In the next test, Julius looked at a design consisting of a square inside another square. Agnes said, "It's a square within a square," and drew precisely that general form. The most elaborate of these tests was done during a stage performance. Bagley handed Julius a diagram made up of a large V shape, a horizontal line, and other elements. A pretty challenging test. Julius called to Agnes, "Draw this." He said nothing else. This is what happened. Agnes first moved her arm as if making a capital V, then drew it on the blackboard and added the horizontal line. Julius then said, "Give the number," and she placed a 2 in the correct position. He said, "Give the rest," and she added the lowercase letter beneath the line. Finally, he asked, "What more?" Agnes added the plus sign, rubbed it out as if uncertain, then restored it, and added a capital X. So she only made one error, the position and extent of the horizontal line. Other researchers tested the couple and were stumped. They'd never encountered a case that wasn't obviously based on a code, and they couldn't figure out how the Zancigs were doing it. But if it really was telepathy, there was a problem there too. The researchers believed that telepathy was real. They'd seen it in other investigations, but never anything as consistent and as reliable as what the Zancigs were doing. Responses given with such amazing speed and precision. They made an audio recording that they could play back and analyze to see if they could find anything in the pauses or vocal inflections that might portray the use of a code, but found nothing. So the couple seemed to be in a class of their own. Here the story takes an odd turn. In 1916, Agnes died. But Julius didn't want to stop the act. It's what he did. It's what he lived for. He married again and persuaded his young wife Ada to take the place of Agnes. Ada didn't take to it, so he teamed up with other partners. First Paul Vucik, then David Bamberg, who both went on to successful careers in magic. Vucik with the stage name Paul Rossini. But at this time, they were still in their teens. In fact, Bamberg was just 13, and it didn't last long. Vucik enlisted in the army when the US went to war in 1917, and Bamberg had to carry on at school. The public lost interest, and the act petered out. Now, obviously, these later acts use codes, and there's a lot of talk about Julius confessing that he used a code, or of his great secret being revealed after his death, and so on. But in fact, he made no secret of it. He was happy to talk about it in interviews, and codes attributed to him actually did get published during his lifetime. Perhaps for this reason, it's he, Julius, who gets the plaudits, while Agnes barely gets a mention. Here's Harry Houdini. "I believe he is one of the greatest second-sight artists that magical history records. In my researches for the past quarter of a century, I have failed to trace anyone his superior. His system seems to be supreme." It's all about the system, the code, the most dauntingly complex two-person communication system of its type ever devised. Absolutely impossible to detect, and so on and so on. But it's quite unlikely that all this adulation was based on the acts with inexperienced new partners in his twilight years. It's surely about the extraordinary success he had with Agnes that drew big crowds. So this is my take. If you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I take seriously the possibility that telepathy is real, from the research that's been done over a century and a half, studies, investigations, experiments, and so on. I wouldn't regard the Zancigs as evidence for it, and I'm not calling them psychics in any sort of formal sense. They belong in the literature of stage magic, not the literature of psychic research. But I do think there was something going on between Julius and Agnes that's been left out of the story, some quite profound connection that most probably developed in childhood and which they later discovered and exploited, since Julius quite obviously was a talented showman. Now, of course, if you know or think you know how the Zancigs were doing it, what kind of code or other trick they were doing, something I've missed, then please leave a comment. I'm happy to be proved wrong. But assuming I'm right about this, what I find so interesting, and I've seen it in different contexts, is how these so-called paranormal phenomena like telepathy sometimes appear in a sort of disguise. In our culture, we don't easily accept the idea of it. It's marginal, alien, unscientific. So if we see it and celebrate it, perhaps to satisfy our need for excitement and mystification and so on, it's transmuted into something we can understand and deal with, an entertainment category, at least unless we look really closely, which few of us are motivated to do. so we can enjoy it without having to worry whether it's actually real and the implications of it being real. Thanks for watching. I've made other videos on telepathy which you might like to check out, and I hope I'll see you there.